Well, I'm very happy to meet Robert Sapolsky today and have you here for a conversation about love and the brain. We're interested in knowing more about the brain, but particularly how it relates to agape love, kindness and compassion. So, hear whatever you have to say.
Well, I think right off the bat, it's one of those themes about a lot of realms of brain and behavior. The brain and altruism, the brain and competition, the brain and aggression, the brain and cooperation, in that we have a nervous system that sets us up for being spectacularly good at being compassionate. And at the same time, we have nervous systems that set us up for excelling at being miserably awful to other organisms. And what's always the case with any of these realms of brain and behavior is just context. Context over and over. In the right setting, we are unmatched in the animal kingdom in terms of the reciprocity we're capable of, the unreciprocated altruism we're capable of, and other settings we are barbarians in a way no other primate can approach. It's just incredibly context dependent.
And when you say settings, do you mean interaction with other primates or human beings, or are you talking about the environment in general?
Other human beings. We have brains, as in most other primates, that set us up for making very, very fast, very automatic distinctions between who is an us and who is a them. In some regards, our brain is doing it on the level of milliseconds before we even have conscious awareness of not only have we seen this face, but we have already categorized it in some way or other. Virtually universally, we like us's a whole lot more than them's, and we show all sorts of in-group bias. And just when one is about to get all depressed about what that means about the state of the world, what's the other defining thing about us is it is so easy to manipulate us as to what counts as an us and what counts as a them. And we could change those categories in a second's time, and the neurobiology follows suit.
Well, I was just going to ask about that because many of the people I know, most of the people I know, are delighted by the other. I mean, very interested in someone who's different. And how does that happen? And how can we perhaps encourage it?
Well, right off the bat, I think that suggests that you're hanging out with a bizarre subset of humans. Our world here of people who thrive on novelty and define themselves by open-mindedness and grow up with the luxury of experiencing diversity when it's always at its most enriching. And for most humans, that's usually not the case. Stick somebody in a brain scanner and you're flashing up faces at them. You're flashing them up for 50 milliseconds, a 20th of a second, just below sort of certainty that you've even seen something. Your visual cortex isn't even quite processing it, but flash up the picture of a face of someone from another race, and your average person in that brain scanner will now have activation of their amygdala. Oh my God, that's like the most depressing thing on earth. That's like, are we hardwired to have this as an us-them distinction? Now, instead, you flash up these faces and all of that, and flash up a face of an other by that criterion, and if you've got the right sort of person in that brain scanner, this person is wearing a baseball cap with a logo for their favorite team, and the neurological reaction is, this is an us. This is someone I'd like lay down my life for because we're all rooting for the same baseball team. That's this category that suddenly dominates, that turns on a dime within a half second. Hardwired categories, that's nonsense. We have all of these categories in our heads simultaneously, and which one is at the forefront can just switch in a second. I mean, just as one bizarre example of this, the same part of the brain, which in every mammal out there tells you if you're eating something that is disgusting. Bacteria, pathogens, spit it out, feel nauseous, throw up. Somewhere, who knows when, 50,000 years ago or something, we evolved the capacity to have moral disgust. And when we feel morally disgusted, the same part of the brain activates. and we feel queasy and we feel sick to our stomach. And wait, no, that's just a metaphor. It's not like moral disgust does not mean there's pathogens in your mouth that you now, but we confuse, oh, that just got somehow like glued on to that brain function when that got invented. So in terms of the brain tinkering, in this realm of love, one of the most like interesting things is this hormone oxytocin, which has lots to do with things that approximate love. In every mammal out there on Earth, oxytocin plays a central role in what's probably the most definedly this looks like love thing out there, mothers and infants bonding to each other. That's what it evolved for, the basic circuitry of it. It has to do with sensory systems imprinting on who's your mom, who's your kid. It's got to do with milk letdown. That's its basic job. And in something like 8% of mammals, it got co-opted, who knows when, to do this other weird thing that a tiny number of mammals do, which is females and males form a pair bond for life. So it's got something to do with that, where it doesn't work quite as well because that kind of got duct taped on. Okay, we just invented this weird thing. Okay, let's grab this mommy baby hormone. And now this has to do with like gibbon monkeys spending their whole life with the same partner. But then it got co-opted for trust. And oxytocin does something with that. And then it turns out we did something totally bizarre in the last 20,000 years. When you stare into the eyes of your beloved dog, both you and the dog secrete oxytocin. Wow. And if you pump up oxytocin levels in your dog stares at you longer and your oxytocin levels go higher. Wait, this hormone that existed for 100 million years so that mommies and babies hook up, and now we're doing it with our pet, and somehow that's been co-opted. And now it turns out when you give somebody oxytocin, they believe a political speech more. They believe a sales pitch more. There's a new field called neuromarketing where people are interested in that. Oxytocin makes you much nicer to in-group members, but it makes you more rotten to out-group members. This is just, of course.
I think most people know your name because of your work with baboons. Could you speak a little bit about that research and how it might relate to our questions?
Well, baboons are distinctively bereft of things that would, I think, pass for love or compassion or fellow feeling. I've studied baboons, population of baboons in East Africa and the Serengeti on and off for about 35 years now. I go back and forth to the same animals. And what I've studied over the years is what does your social rank and what does your personality, which is a real scientific word when it comes to talking about other species, not just us, and what does the social group that you live in have to do with who gets the stress-related diseases, who's got the high blood pressure, who's gotten the rotten cholesterol levels. And what I thought I was mostly studying at the beginning is why is it that being a high-ranking baboon does great things for your health? What it took me about 30 years to figure out is the much more interesting and important question is to ask why is it that a baboon who has social affiliations and social connections has better health. We've known forever if you are chronically stressed, that does rotten things to your learning and memory. It does bad things to anxiety levels. It predisposes us towards learning to be afraid of things that we shouldn't. It predisposes us towards depression. It works in the frontal cortex to make our judgment terrible. But it's only more recent work, and this has been from a few groups, including mine, looking at a part of the brain called the anterior cingulate. It's part of the cortex, and if you want an incredibly simplified soundbite as to what it has to do with any of this stuff, it's got something to do with empathy. Poke somebody's finger with a pin, and all sorts of pain-related pathways in the brain activate, including the anterior cingulate. It's not telling you whether it's this finger or this finger which is in pain. It's telling you what the meaning is of it. It's a more integrative cortical part of the brain. Now instead, poke the fingertip of your loved one and watch that, and the anterior cingulate activates. The parts of the brain that are saying, was it my finger or my toe, they're sound asleep, this isn't their problem. But it's the anterior cingulate. It's got something to do with empathy.
Empathy is one thing, compassion is another. I can feel sad and I can feel empathy toward this person who's been hurt.
Okay.
But am I going to do something about it?
Good.
And
Let's
compassion
talk
basically
about that.
takes that next step, and actually
Good.
we
That's an
seem
incredibly interesting distinction. Okay, people who have spent a long time studying the psychology, the biology of, say, moral development. And it turns out in that literature that gives you virtually zero prediction as to who's going to step out of the crowd and do the scary thing that nonetheless is the right thing to do. Total dislocation. In the same way, from my read of the literature, there's a remarkable dissociation between the intensity with which you feel sympathy, with which you feel empathy, and actually going and doing something to help someone. And in a remarkably clear readout, you get people in a distressed, empathic state about somebody else going through something painful. And the question is whether they are going to, in effect, find a way to, I can't deal with this anymore, versus actually do something. Look at their blood pressure. If their blood pressure, their heart rate, their sympathetic nervous system is aroused and going like crazy, what they're most likely to be thinking about is how unpleasant this is for them, and they're going to turn the other way. If this is someone who is, in effect, sufficiently dispassionately being able to recognize the reality of that person in need, in addition to the froth of their own empathy, if they're not getting swamped with their own visceral responses, that's the person who's much more likely to be able to go and actually do something about it. And in a sense, that's the autonomic nervous system equivalent of sort of Buddhist views of you need a certain detachment, you need a certain distance. We're very bad at intensely feeling somebody else's distress, and not kind of getting sidetracked into getting a little bit preoccupied with how distressed we're feeling at the time. I mean, you don't suspect there's a whole lot of evenings where Bill Gates is sitting there in agony over the pains of the world because he's so empathically flooded with it. Instead, he is bringing just a tactical, cerebral approach to doing more good in a more thought-out, distanced kind of way than it. That's a remarkably adult sort of way in which one turns empathy as a construct into actual compassionate action.
I was nodding my head because I have classes full of students who are in my other class learning about international women's health and human rights, and the concern and the desire to make change. What can I do? And it's a little hard for them to immediately swallow my advice, which is learn, be as good a student as you possibly can, and then in the next phase of life, act. This is what you can do. They want to get on planes and of course and go do things.
It's wonderful.
It is.
When I was 16, my mother caught me just about ready to mail off a check of what had been all of my bank savings to a foundation that was trying to save mountain gorillas. And wait, that's for college. You can't. Yeah,
Absolutely.
It's amazing. It's wonderful. It's often not very effective. And the big downside of adult, skillful, dispassionate effectiveness at it is you're about 1.5 neurons away at that point at skillful and dispassionate ways of figuring out why it's not really your problem. And you're way too busy and somebody else will take care of it. So that's the downside there, of course. That's funny.
Well, thanks again. This is very, very nice of you to take the time.
Sure,
We really appreciate it.